Hello everyone, and welcome to another video Dvar Torah. As this very strange summer begins to come to a close, we are now turning our attention to a very strange back-to-school season. Are kids going back to school in September? For that matter, are teachers going back to school in September? For how long? What will classrooms look like? How will teachers and students deal with masks and social distancing? Are we headed for another spike in COVID-19 cases? Will there be another lockdown? We know that all of these questions have been the subject of much debate amongst ourselves and certainly government representatives who bear the great responsibility of balancing our health and personal safety with the needs of our society to continue to function. Some of us think that the plan for our kids and teachers to go back to school in September is ludicrous, while others feel that it is a necessity of the highest importance with manageable risks. Of course, only time will tell which approach is the wiser. It's the unfortunate nature of wisdom that sometimes it can only be revealed in retrospect. And it's even more often true that by the time we realize that we are the ones that have been proven wrong, we've dug in our heels so forcefully that we find ourselves in the position of having to justify all kinds of horrifying things before we finally relent. That's assuming we ever do. Unfortunately, it's human nature to be stubborn, and that's mostly because being wrong sucks. But sometimes the human instinct to protect our ego can be so strong that we would rather destroy ourselves and others rather than admit to our mistakes. This week's parsha is Shoftim. Moses continues his final speech to the assembled Israelite nation, laying the foundations for the Israelite justice system. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. True justice shall you pursue. The Israelite nation shall appoint wise judges to adjudicate disputes, and when a person is accused of a capital offense, they can only be convicted on the testimony of at least 2 eyewitnesses. Moses also foresees that the Israelite nation will one day wish to appoint a king, and when that time comes, the Israelite king shall be bound to Torah and the rule of law. The king shall be humble under God and never amass too much wealth, too many horses, or too many wives for himself. It sounds for a moment like quite an idyllic framework for a benevolent king who serves his people rather than a ruthless king who forces his people to serve him. It sounds like a good king who is wise and kind, a king like Solomon, the builder of the first temple. But then we think to ourselves, wait a second, didn't Solomon have something like 1,000 wives? Was that right? Wait, how's that possible? In the first book of Malachim, or Kings, chapter 11, verse 3, it states, he, that is King Solomon, had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And a few verses earlier, the Tanakh boasts that he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. And there are several verses that also describe King Solomon's great wealth. While it is true that Moses didn't exactly say how many wives should be considered too many wives, or how many horses should be too many horses, we can simply just point out that the medieval commentator Rashi seems to think that, for whatever reason, Moses meant that 18 wives should be the cutoff. I'm not here to argue exactly how many wives I think are too many, but let's just all agree that 700 wives and 300 concubines is a lot more than 18, and we'll be content to say that Moses would likely not have approved. So, then, if King Solomon was clearly in violation of the Torah, how are we supposed to hold him in such high esteem? Solomon the wise, author of the Song of Songs, the Book of Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Solomon the King of Peace, whose name means peace. Solomon the servant of God who built the first great temple in Jerusalem. The answer depends upon how stubborn we're willing to be. If we take an honest look at the Tanakh, it gives us a perfectly human answer. King Solomon was not the perfect king that epitomizes the unified golden era of Israelite history. The text specifically describes how King Solomon's faith was not as strong as his father, King David's, and that his lust turned him away from God, and even he began to practice forms of idolatry. However, if instead we wanted to preserve the iconic image of King Solomon the Wise, then the rabbis of the Talmud offer this story. I give you an excerpt of a rather long series of altercations between King Solomon and Ashmedai, the demon king. And before I begin, because there will be those who perhaps don't believe me, you're welcome to look it up for yourself in Masechet Gitin, page 68, Amud Bet. Ashmedai, the demon king, came before King Solomon and said, "Take off the magical protective chain and ring enchanted within the engraved name of God, and I will show you my strength." Solomon removed his chain and ring and gave them to Ashmedai, who swallowed the ring and grew until he placed one wing in the heavens and one wing on earth. He then threw Solomon a distance of 400 parasangs, equivalent of about 2,400 of our kilometers. With Solomon deposed from the throne, Ashmedai assumed the visage, the form of Solomon, and took his place. Ashmedai then demanded of the queens to engage in forbidden sexual conduct, and when the sages of the Sanhedrin learned that the disturbed king had even commanded his own mother Bathsheba to engage in relations with him, they understood that this was an impostor and not actually Solomon. The Sanhedrin brought Solomon to the royal palace with a new chain and signet ring engraved with God's ineffable name, and when Solomon entered, Ashmedai saw him and fled. It's a wonderfully bizarre legend, and one that is actually quite beautiful and enlightening if we imagine that the rabbis of the Talmud were actually trying to understand and discuss what they perceived as mental illness while lacking the medical knowledge that we have today. I also find it most interesting that their approach is actually consistent with modern psychology in that we are meant to treat some forms of mental illness almost as though it is a different entity that is interfering with a person's healthy brain function, sometimes to the point that a person may not even be responsible for his or her own actions. In the end, however, the Tanakh teaches that it was due to King Solomon's personal failings that ultimately led to the fracturing of the united Israelite kingdom. And this, like it or not, is part of Solomon's legacy. So, who is King Solomon to us? Is he King Solomon the Wise, who was temporarily replaced by Ashmedai the demon king? Or is he Solomon the great ruler, who was also a human being, who likely suffered in his later years from mental illness, who failed to keep the laws of Torah, who became an apostate, turned to idolatry, and whose actions led to the end of the united kingdom of Israel? Yes, there is certainly much to learn from the rabbi's story of King Solomon and Ashmedai, but it's not the kind of lesson that saves a civilization from a mentally ill leader. And the more we insist on a fundamentalist approach to our own beliefs, the more we risk finding ourselves 2,400 kilometers away from reality. As we get closer to the end of the summer, I wish for all of us in this next phase of the COVID-19 era clarity of mind in our thoughts and beliefs, a willingness to change and adapt our actions and behaviors, and, dare I say, a sense of cautious optimism for the future as we keep in mind the adage, "It is far better to admit that one does not know where one is than to go about adamantly insisting that one is where one is not." Shabbat Shalom.